All right. So what we were discussing yesterday is that you're not allowed to assume that a loan is meant to be recorded in a shtar unless you have approval from both the creditor and the debtor. The debtor may want the shtar to remain the loan to remain just oral. Okay. So that was what we had seen yesterday. Right? A shtar, when the creditor has a shtar chov, he can collect from encumbered property. When the creditor does not have a shtar chov, he can only collect from free property that is unencumbered, right? Okay. Now, aval im kanu miyado shalova b'fnei hamalva. So what is that halacha? So there's a the statement was that if a kinyan was made at the time when the loan was done, they did an actual chalipin, they did a handkerchief in the presence of the two witnesses. That's tantamount to the debtor saying, I hereby give permission to write up paper, to write up a promissory note. He says, Aval im kanu miyadu shalova b'fnei hamalva. He says, Dahol v'kana b'kinyan suder l'fnei edim, because since there was a kinyan that was done in front of witnesses, amrinan kaven dehikna lo ba'ayin yafa kol kach, vadai ein makbid b'kala. So we assume that since the lova took a hold of the handkerchief in the presence of the two witnesses, we see that he's truly trying to demonstrate his full and unconditional commitment to pay back the debt. And if so, that's also a sign that he doesn't mind if paper is drawn up. People know about the debt, and therefore he's giving permission for the creditor to collect from encumbered property. And so we assume, therefore, the witnesses, because now they know about it, and it's been done in such a emphatic way, sort of the news will travel about this loan, and therefore it's something that we can do a title search on. And therefore they can write up a shtar, a promissory note, because again, the assumption is that this loan was done with a kinyan, and when something's done with a kinyan, it's meant to be recorded in a shtar. But when does this kinyan mean? When is it meaningful? Only when, at the time of the kinyan, the malva also gives him the cash. Aval imrak hodelo shechayev lo va'asa al ze kinyan. But if the lova, if the debtor just says, I owe you $1,000, and there was no exchange of cash to signify that, and va'asa al ze kinyan, and then he made a kinyan, ayin lekaman divrei maschala filu. So we'll see that in just a moment. Good morning. We'll see in just a minute what the significance of that is. What's the Mazel Tov? Just the first? Oh, wonderful. Mazel Tov. Mazel Tov. Mazel Tov. Wonderful. So Rob Gross. Rob and Pam. Okay. Wonderful news. Thank you. Is this their first grandchild? Wow. Okay. Lovely. So was a boy, girl? Girl. Okay. So wonderful. Okay. Bifnei hamalve. Okay, so it has to be done, the kinyan has to be done in the presence of the malva. So we said it has to be done in the presence of the malva. There has to be an exchange of cash. If a kinyan was made not in the presence of the malva, but let's say in the presence of a representative, then you would not write up the paper. V'yesh cholkin bazeh, and some disagree. We're getting much more technical now. I don't know. Maybe if it's a designated shaliach, it would help. Maybe if it's just something that the debtor sets up, maybe it wouldn't help. Okay, would have to do more research on that. The kinyan sudar. If the kinyan that we're talking about is what we call a kinyan sudar, which means that the malva gives the lova an object like a handkerchief or a pen or something like that. The lova picks it up, and in so doing creates that exchange, what we would call consideration in legal terminology, where in exchange for receiving this or picking up this handkerchief, I give to you, I exchange over to you my debt, my obligation. Ayin kan bebiurim geder ubir kinyan sudar. He says, we go into more depth as to what a kinyan sudar is, something that you do with the rabbi when you sell your chametz, right? And so the rabbi gives you his pen or his handkerchief, and you, in exchange, give the rabbi the rights to sell your chametz. In other words, there's an exchange going on. The Shulchan Aruch says that the object itself has to be a certain minimal size. The cloth, if you're using a handkerchief, has to be at least 3 by 3 fingers so that it's a significant object. It doesn't matter what the material is. It could be wool, linen, or any other material. Mikol makom shem kli alav. It has to have the name of a kli. It has to be called a kli. Ve'imhu beged shalem afim ein bo gimel al gimel shaper dami. If it's a complete garment, even if it's less than 3 by 3 fingers, meaning it's not just a piece of fabric, but let's say it's a glove or something like that, so that it can be even smaller. Lachein avneit, and therefore a belt, what we call a gartel, she'ein bo rochav gimel etzbos kasher medina lasos bo kinyan sudar. You can use a gartel to create a kinyan sudar. So next time you're davening in the shtibel and you want to give a loan to your Hasidic friend, so he'll take off his gartel and he'll give it to you. He'll pick it up. I mean, concept. When are you saying what different cases do we make kinyanim?
Styles or types, there's different names that they call.
Right. Well, so there's in the wedding that's also a kinyan sudar. In the mechiras chametz that's also a kinyan sudar. But there's other. Yeah, but because the pen is a kli, that's the reason why it's just convenient to use a pen. But we could use a handkerchief. I sometimes use my watch, my car keys. It could be anything. There are other types of kinyanim. There's a kinyan meshicha, when you pull, let's say, an animal or an object that's too difficult to lift up. There's a kinyan hagbaha, when you lift something up in order to acquire it. But those are not mechanisms to create indebtedness. The mechanism to create indebtedness is what we call a kinyan chalipin or a kinyan sudar. Yes, that's right. It's not meant that the person who's taking the handkerchief acquires it forever. It's only a temporary lifting up of it to show an exchange. That's really the word chalipin, lahachalip, is to exchange. It's to exchange. So now that you've asked it, Moish, so we'll just learn a little bit about the biurim to understand the concept of what this kinyan does. If you take a look at the biurim, he says, Inyan kinyan sudar hanikra kinyan chalipin, the mevur b'shulchan aruch siman kuf tzadi a, v'nati kan divrei alavush sham sifalav shekasa v'ziloshana. Ksiv bezos lefanim b'Yisrael v'gomer shalaf ish na'alo v'nosan l'reyehu v'gomer. Where's this pasuk from? Who can tell me? Yes, very good. It's from Megillas Rus. That what was the exchange? What was the kinyan that was being made at the time? What? Yes, but what was the context? What was going on at the time? Well, it was it was an exchange that Boaz was making with Ploni Almoni. In order to, Ploni Almoni had to relinquish his rights to the estate of Elimelech because he didn't want to marry Rus. That was it was conditional on that he would have the right to purchase it and to marry Rus, but he relinquished that right and gave it instead to Boaz. So Ploni Almoni is giving over, relinquishing his rights. So Boaz would have to give something to Ploni Almoni in exchange of receiving that right. Upirusho shazeh. So that was the way it was done, that a person would take off his shoe and give it to his friend. Okay? Upirusho shazeu kinyan sudur shahakona yitain kli lamakna. So the way that it would work is that the purchaser, the acquirer, would give an object, a kli, to the person giving or selling the object. V'haya hakli mashahu, v'yakna lo hamakna hachefetz o hakarka shekona mimenu chalife hakli shehu nosein lo. So the kli could be anything, and the giver, in exchange for receiving the object, would thereby transfer the object that he is selling, whether it's a chattel or real estate, and that's the exchange. You give me something, I give you something. Chalipin, v'hu anikra chalipin, uperish hapasuk kenhu. So therefore, we understand the pasuk as follows: Sholaf ish nalo. When the pasuk says that the person would take off his shoe, perush Boaz sholaf nalo v'nasan l're'ehu hu hagoyel. That Boaz took off his shoe and gave it to his friend Ploni Almoni, who was originally intended to be the redeemer, okay, of the estate. V'hagoel hikna lo Boaz zechuso shahayalo bisadosav shel machlon chalife hakli shelo. And the Goel, Ploni Almoni, in exchange for receiving Boaz's shoe, gave him the right that he had previously had in the fields of Machlon, Elimelech's son, in exchange for the kli that he was getting from Boaz. The zehu din kinyan hachalipin shenohig beinenu ad kan l'shana. And that's the mechanism that we use today of chalipin. Because of b'shulchan aruch, de'im hikna echad kli l'moicher, kedei sheyikna halokeach oso hamemkar zacha halokeach. So the Shulchan Aruch writes that in kind, if a person wishes to purchase an object and he gives a kli to the seller so that he can acquire it, and by the way, we're talking now here about a third party. Let's say you have a third party, Levi. Reuven is the seller, Shimon is the buyer. Okay? Levi can go over to Reuven and say, I would like to acquire the object you're selling, the pot that you're selling, on behalf of Shimon. So I'm giving you my handkerchief, and in exchange for the handkerchief that I'm giving you, make sure that this pot is legally transferred over to Shimon. And that is a valid mechanism of kinyan. That's right. Vafilu hikneu shelo bifnei hakona. Even if this transfer was done in Shimon's absence, Haga, and the Ramah then writes, "Ulakach horgalu lasos hakinyan besuder shel edim afilu bifnei hakona lefi sharov hakinyanim hein shelo bifnei hakona." And that's why the custom is to use the handkerchief of the witnesses that belong to the witnesses, because it became customary to do that in order to, because a lot of times the purchaser was not present. So the witnesses sort of represent that third party. And that's what we do today, is that other than selling the chametz, but what we do, let's say at a chuppah, I will go over to the witnesses and I'll take out my pen or my handkerchief and I'll say, here, witness, well, I go over to one of the witnesses and I say, here, make this yours. And then I say, okay, now give the handkerchief to the chassan, and he'll do a kinyan chalipin and indebt himself to the kala. And what is he doing by indebting himself? He's indebting the ksuva, the shtar ksuva. He's making it hers. He's legally making it hers. Okay, so that's what's going on at the chassan's tish. Okay.
Why can't you just take
What do you mean take? What do you mean take the ksuva? You mean as a represent? You mean you'd have to say that the Masadar Kiddushin is acting as a representative of the kala. Perhaps you could, but this is a more binding method of kinyan. It's a more official method of kinyan. Okay. And umashma v'pashtus. So you see from this case of the Shulchan Aruch, the kinyan chalipin lo boi dafka b'chli dekona, that you don't need that the object belongs to the acquirer, to the person receiving the item. Ala'afim hakoina lo zacha bo klal. So you see from here that even if the purchaser, the acquirer, was not involved at all in the process, the ish acher nosein kli shelo lamakna shaper habikinyan, and a third party gives the kli to the seller or to the giver, that it's a valid kinyan. Uvazeh shahamakna zacha besudur shel acherim nasa hakinyan v'nikna al yedei zeh hachefetz mehamakna lahakona, and it's just the fact that the seller or the giver acquires an object from some third party, that is the thing that consummates the transfer. Below ba'inan shahasuru yeh shalakona dafka. He's repeating himself. We don't require that the handkerchief belong to the acquirer. V'hurgalu lasos hakinyan besudur shel edim, and the minig is to use the sudar of the witnesses. V'chein kosav lahedja b'haktzos hachoshen, and the Ktsos writes that as well. And he goes on from there. Okay, so just make sure that we didn't miss anything vital over here. I'm not going to get into that now. Okay. All right, let us go further. So, afilu lo hilva lo klum, ella shehikn lo bekinyan suder shu chayev lo mana, hare ha'idem rishayim lichto v'lachtom v'litein liyad zeh shenis chayev lo. So if witnesses are standing in front of a lova and a malva, a borrower and a lender, even if they did not see the exchange of money, but the lova says expressly, I have borrowed money from you and I am indebting myself to you to pay it back with the kinyan suder, then the witnesses may assume that that is also a tacit agreement, that he wants a promissory note drawn up. Now, so afilu lo hilva lo klum. So we had seen contrary to that in the Imrei Yaakov just a moment ago, that the witnesses have to witness the transfer of the cash. So which one is it? So harab sasam kan demoel b'chol gavne. He says, the Rav Shulchan Aruch says that even if there's no exchange of cash, as long as the lova says expressly, I owe you $1,000, then the witnesses take that as, and he makes a kinyan, then that's their cue that they can write up paper. He says, Aval be'emes denechluku bazeh haposkim. But this is actually a machlokas haposkim. Diyesh omrim de'eno moel rakecha shekano miyado sheyitin lo chovo ad zman ploni. He says, because some say that it only helps when the kinyan is made and the lova says, I hereby pledge to pay you back by a certain date. Aval im omar stam hineni modelacha bekinyan bifnei edem sheni chayv lecha lo mahani. But if the lova just says, I owe you $1,000, and he doesn't pledge that he'll pay it back by a certain date, then that's not enough of an acknowledgement or an admission to warrant drawing up paper. The alma yachol hakinyan, arei eno makna lo ata shum davar. He says, because then the kinyan is too nebulous, because since the lender did not, the malva did not give him any cash, then what exchange has taken place, right? V'yesh cholkim usvirale demoil hakinyan af b'chai gavna she'osa kinyan al shibet machasav shemakna osam liyosam meshubadim lo b'tzarchi and ladin. Other poskim disagree, and they say by virtue of the fact that the lova took the handkerchief of the malva, he is what the exchange that he's giving to the malva is giving him a lien on all of his property. That's what's being exchanged, even if there's no cash being exchanged. And as a result, it is valid, even if the lova does not explicitly state, I will pay you back by a certain date. Then it's considered to be a legally binding debt. And you know, there may not be a hard date by which the debt must be paid off, but nonetheless, the malva has a lien on his property, which is collectible at some point down the road. Even if he has to wait until he dies, he can certainly collect it from his estate. Okay. Now, so therefore, afal pisha hamischayv lo omer lahem lichtov, and the Rav Shulchan Aruch had said, now this halacha is true, even if the debtor did not say explicitly write paper. Lefi shestam kinyan leksiva omed. He says, because whenever a kinyan is consummated, that's a sign that there's a desire to have it recorded in a shtar. Ela imkain hamischayev mochem elichtov. Unless at the time of making the kinyan, the debtor says, I do not want this to be recorded in a note. If he says that explicitly, then the Edom do not write up the note. Bafilu im nishtahez man meruba. So then the next halacha is that this is true, that the witnesses can draw up paper even if a long time has elapsed from the time of the loan to the time of when they draw up the paper. Let's say the creditor says, guys, you remember a year ago, I lent this guy money because he was desperate during COVID, and I brought over the cash, gave it to him, you were witnesses to it, and at the time we didn't have time to draw up the promissory note. I'd like to draw up the promissory note now and have you guys sign that paper. So that the halacha is, the witnesses can draw it up. They don't have to consult the debtor to make sure that to make sure it's okay, or to make sure that he hasn't already paid it back. Why? They don't have to consult with the debtor. And they also don't have to worry that maybe it was paid back already. Okay, because if a guy has borrowed money in the presence of witnesses, he would be a fool to pay it back without witnesses, right? Because where's the evidence? Okay.
That happened a year ago.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, the Imrei Yaakov says, the Kosvin Zman Hakinyan. They have to record that the loan took place at such and such a date. It happened a year ago, whenever it happened.
Which proves that the signature doesn't imply that it just implies what they witnessed at the time.
Right, it says what they witnessed a year ago. Yeah. Yes, the lien starts from that time. Exactly. Um, oh, he has a very interesting shaila over here. Which is really a tangent, but it's something that we've discussed before. Yesh livrarer mahu haderech hanachon lagabe mitzvah shiluach hakein sherotza ha'adam l'kayimo. What is the correct protocol for the mitzvah of shiluach hakein? Now we know that a person, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of shiluach hakein, sending away the mother bird and taking the eggs, you have to do it in a place that's, it can only be done if the nest is resting on a place that does not belong to anybody. It's hefker, or it belongs to the city. But if the nest is resting on private property, then the mitzvah no longer applies. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
It doesn't even apply to you.
Doesn't even apply to you. So there's no mitzvah of shiluach hakein if the place is owned by a private individual. And how do we know that? Because the Torah says you encounter the nest baderech, on the road. So if it's not on the road, like public area, so there's no mitzvah. Now, the question first of all arises, and this is something that I did in a sugya shir a few years back: is there a mitzvah to send away the mother bird if you don't want the eggs? Okay.
Kind of discuss the eggs. Well, you might just want the mitzvah.
You want to do the mitzvah. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, there was a rabbi here who went around Ontario to find a firstborn donkey, because there's a mitzvah of pidyon peter chamor. They redeeming the firstborn donkey. Okay. I was somewhat hesitant to participate. He asked if we could do it at the bayit. I made a slight inquiry, and we were worried about the donkey pooping all over the carpet. So we said. So we decided it was a no-go, and so he found another venue. Perfectly fine. The question is, so why would he do it? Why drive around Ontario looking for a firstborn donkey? And so his argument was, it's a mitzvah, one of the 613 mitzvahs. You should try to find a way to fulfill it. So my reaction was, divorcing your wife is one of the 613 mitzvahs. Right? That's right. So, I mean, how far do you extend this? Peter Chamor. I understand. It seems to me that this is not a productive exercise for a Jew to engage in. But obviously, there are those who disagree with me. I'm more of a rationalist. I'm not going to start running around Ontario to find donkeys so that I can fulfill this mitzvah, just like I'm not going to divorce my wife so that I can say I did one more mitzvah. Okay? There are certain mitzvos that are mitzvos kiyumios, which means when you find yourself in a particular circumstance, here's what you must do in order to fulfill God's decree for those who are in that circumstance. But there is no obligation to put yourself in a particular circumstance in order to fulfill that mitzvah. I'll continue Mitzvah Shem tomorrow. Okay? You know, I'm surprised.
But